what the FBI does in their forensic team is to take everything apart, every piece of it, to examine it with the special lights, with the special chemicals that Dr. Miller knows so much about. And you just cannot get there. You can't get, you're going to miss something.
Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the best guests in true crime, and tonight is no exception. But first, it's been 2 months and 2 days since 4 young University of Idaho students were savagely murdered, stabbed to death in their off-campus home. As you know by now, before every show, I like to remember the victims. Let us never forget those young lives lost way too soon. Madison Mogen, 21, Kaylee Goncalves, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20. May their memories be a blessing. Now, police say that the killer is 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger. We want to remind everyone that Bryan Kohberger is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Today's best guest lineup, you're looking at them right now. You've got Sunnetta Sunny Slaughter. She is the founder and managing principal of Sunny Slaughter Consulting, LLC. She's been called the Master Connector and the Olivia Pope of Crime. And you probably saw her on YouTube today, which is why she's the Master Connector. She was featured in Women Leadership Magazine USA as one of DC's top 25 women business leaders in 2020 and 2021. She's also a TEDx speaker. And Miss Slaughter is a federally certified law enforcement instructor. The man with a DNA helix behind him, very aptly present there, is Dr. Monty Miller. He has the education, training, and experience to provide expert services related to DNA, crime lab, crime scene investigation, and paternity, all kinships, and all arenas where scientific information related to these topics requires expert interpretation. Dr. Miller previously worked for the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, State Crime Lab as a forensic scientist, and Dr. Miller distinguished himself as an expert witness, testifying on such matters as crime scenes, capital murder, sexual assault, robbery, and others. And now, quick housekeeping notes. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. On Twitter, we are at Podcast STS. Please support us at Patreon. And now there is a YouTube membership channel option. I don't know what that is. My wife tells me it exists, so join and subscribe. And please, as my 8-year-old daughter says, hit that like and subscribe button because it helps the algorithm. Now, on to some of the latest news, and we'll send it off to Sunny after I tell you what it is. But Olivia Goncalves, and that is Kaylee's sister, she spoke to Brian Enton, who's a friend of the show and a friend of my wife and I, and he interviewed her exclusively last night on News Nation. And she said, and I'm quoting now, "The relief that we all felt at having a suspect in custody, it was like, I can't even describe. It was like the weight of the world's been lifted off our shoulders." Sonny, this has to have been, it's unparalleled. There's no way to really know what a victim's family is going through unless you're, God forbid, a victim yourself. But what kind of relief must this be for the family?
Well, thank you first for having me on the show. And unfortunately, I actually do know what this feels like. I am the sister in love of a high-profile murder victim. And I know what it's like, even though I'm a law enforcement instructor from a personal standpoint, having someone in custody, getting to this point in the investigation really matters to the family because they can start not getting justice, but at least getting some answers. This is going to be a long time coming. What happens when in family dynamics with this is that everyone, they have their individual experiences and they also have a collective experience. I'm sure that The sister is what I always call an indirect victim. Parents are more closely monitored, but the siblings matter a great deal. And it is important that we remember all of them. This is not the end. This is the very much the beginning of what they'll go through for the rest of their lives.
I'm sorry to hear that you experienced that firsthand. I had no idea. So again, sorry to hear that. The phrase true evil came up, Dr. Monty Miller. I know you see things more through a scientific lens, but Olivia, the sister of Kaylee, went on to say that neither she nor Kaylee had any idea that, again, quote unquote, true evil was genuinely watching them, as Bryan Kohberger allegedly returned to the house at least 12 times leading up to these quadruple murders. It doesn't say he went into the house at any point. He was there 12 times. From a strictly scientific and forensic standpoint, does that help the case in any way, at least with digital forensics?
Yeah, I mean, the digital footprint is really important here. Right now, all we know is that we have the DNA of his or that's consistent with him on a knife. But that's not enough. I mean, somebody could borrow your knife and leave the sheath there, and it might have, your DNA on it. So having a sheath isn't enough. Now, there might be other evidence there. It's common when somebody is doing stabbing someone that their hand will slide down and cut themselves. So there might be other evidence of his there. There might be other DNA and some other things. But right now, all we know is there's DNA on that sheath, and other than that, they need other things like the digital footprint, where he's been, the fact that he was close. They need all of these other police work to come together to go with that DNA. Right now, the DNA, like you said at the beginning, he's innocent until proven guilty. And the DNA on a knife sheath doesn't make you a murderer all by itself. But some of those other things, he was there in the area. And then, of course, the cleaning out of his car and all of those other actions that he took. Those things are all very important in tying him to the crime, and the things that he did that make him look guilty, besides his DNA being at the crime scene.
And as we go on this hour and change, we'll dig deeper into some of the DNA aspects of this case, particularly that knife sheath, which seems to be the strongest piece of evidence right now. Back to Sunny for a moment. Olivia Goncalves went on to say, and this was a little heart-wrenching, and I quote here, "It's really difficult not to do more, not to have known more, but it's just the first step," as you just alluded to, Sonny. A lot more evidence will come out, and I'm confident Moscow police and Idaho State Police have the right person, and I thank them from the very bottom of my heart. The family at one point, and I'm talking about the father here, Steve Goncalves, was quite critical of law enforcement. He walked back those comments on News Nation a few days back, but you can't help but feel for the sister who, and to some degree here, seems to be, I don't say blaming herself, but feeling like they could have done more. That's a heavy burden to bear.
Right. The amount of guilt that a family often feels about what they missed, and what you begin replaying this scenario in your head as the survivors and the indirect victim. When was the last time you talked to the person? What did you say to them? What if anything they might have said that you just kind of shook off as not being relevant at the time? And that is a heavy burden to bear. And then the conversations that they might be having now amongst themselves as family members. The father was, I'll use this term, but not in a very professional way. He was consistent with his behavior in how he felt about what was not happening and the information that he was not initially getting from law enforcement. That is a very real and parental response. It is what most people do. It is what a lot of the audience did, but they are not as connected. Why aren't we getting answers? Why is it this happening? So the families, there's so much attention in a high profile case. the level of attention and scrutiny that the family feel on themselves personally and what the public request and require of them also matters. Everybody's trying to find answers. And there are no answers to find until you do. And right now, unfortunately, we're not there yet.
And I'll go one step further. I think even once you get answers, it's really tough to still fill that void, although it can help a little bit, but it's going to be tough to mitigate that grief. I just had on as a programming note, Kerry Rawson, who's the daughter of the BTK serial killer. And, I've said it before on the show. It was 18 years ago that she was notified. Her father had been killing since, I think, 1972. And the trauma that she feels is still very evident and very understandable. Dr. Miller, we're getting to the science in a moment, but curious about your take on this. There is chatter now online, unconfirmed, I'm going to make that very clear, that the suspected killer, Bryan Kohberger, showed up at this vigil a few weeks back in Moscow, Idaho. Again, not confirmed. And a law enforcement official who I was reading about was quoted as saying, I don't think it would be a far-fetched thing for him to show up at this vigil. I know, again, you're a doctor, Monty Miller, but in your past experience, especially someone who appears to be aspiring to be a serial killer, would this seem somewhat normal for that kind of abnormal, aberrant behavior?
Well, I think that the police regularly collect videos of those kinds of events because a lot of them, do reportedly go to those things. But also, we got to remember that there are, thousands or hundreds of, or however many people show up to these things. All of those people showed up that were, connected and cared, and so a lot of times it's just people that care. And so maybe he did live in close proximity. It's reasonable that he would go there of his own accord, just like a lot of the other people. But again, it's part of that digital footprint where you're trying to look at the whole thing. And I mean, it's kind of creepy, really, that they do that, and they go there and they soak in the pain of the others, and it's awful, and they get to relive their moment again and again. It's kind of like that Kleinfelder syndrome where they're feeding off of this pain of others, and they enjoy doing it, and now they want to go feed on that on everybody else's pain as well. And it's horrible.
Can I say this really quick? It is also a way, because this is sometimes consistent with narcissistic behavior in criminal profiling and criminal contact, where people go back over and over again to the scenes and participate. It's in a lot of high profile cases, you will see that happening. But also, one of the things, which is the reason why law enforcement in their investigation are always taking pictures of the crime scenes, vigils, at funerals, because they want to know who is showing up so they can, as Dr. Miller said, match it with the footprint, but also look back as part of what they were looking for. And sometimes killers want to know how close investigators are to what has happened and the information that they are obtaining. So if they're friends with the family, they're getting information. If they're friends, they're reading and looking at the same things that we're all looking at. Speculation, what the police are putting out. That's why silence is always best from law enforcement.
And we know now through digital forensics by the cell phone records that he went back to the crime scene that morning, apparently to check things out. Dr. Miller, to you, former FBI agent Jennifer Koffendorfer, who's a friend of the show and previous guest, was quoted in Newsweek as saying that she believes that there's a quote unquote treasure trove of DNA evidence that's going to be found at Kohberger's apartment and in the vehicle he was driving. Do you agree with that assessment? We'll get into the details a little later, but do you agree with that off the cuff?
I mean, certainly you'd think that it would be a bloody scene and he would have blood all over him. So he either cleaned up, was covered in something, and then took that off, maybe put it in a bag. But I mean, initially at the crime scene, as he left, he certainly would have had ample blood on him. But I'm not sure how his car was. I mean, he might have had a place where he could have disrobed, had a covering, and got very little to, if he was careful, he could get little blood in there. But there certainly is the potential for there to be a lot if he hadn't prepared in advance to disrobe and clean himself off.
And then Sonny, back to some of the mental health struggles. Obviously, we talked about the victim's family. That is quite understandable. There were some writings that people unearthed. It is still to be 100% confirmed and corroborated, but many people believe it is the writings of a 17-year-old suspect, Bryan Kohberger, from an online forum. He talked about something called visual snow. He said he had a medical condition consisting of migraines and toxins, and went on to say that every test known to man cannot show what's wrong with us. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I always feel, and this is when he was 17, I always feel like I'm not there. There's delusions of grandeur. Everyone hates me, even saying I'm an a-hole. Again, not confirmed yet, but many people believe this to be authentic. If so, what about the fact that at 17, he appeared to be struggling so much with his mental health? Is there anything in hindsight that you think could have been done?
I think once we figure out if he is the perpetrator of this crime, I think one, his mental health is going to be in strong question. Like, and the things that he did as a young person, when you think about someone who committed a horrific crime like this, what they were thinking, and if he is the perpetrator, he was very calculated in the information and the classes that he was taking. And I would suspect that he may have he may have done other things growing up. And that would be a conversation with those who he went to school with. What did his teachers think of him before he became who he is now? What did people look at him and say? What were the potential indicators, if any, that he was having a problem? Now, he did, during his hearing, say that he had no mental health conditions and that he was not taking any medication. And in my litigation work, that would be one of the things that, on the defense side, we would be looking at to kind of tie it in on what they could be trying to think of if this goes to trial, if he's a person, on how he could backdoor his way into a potentially lesser sentence if he is charged, if he is convicted of this.
Dr. Miller, back to you and back to this Agent Koffendorfer quote from Newsweek. She went on to say, I think the treasure trove is in that apartment, meaning in Pullman, Washington, and in the car. She says, in my experience, you just really can't hide blood evidence. It sinks in. Just imagine the upholstery of your car, the gas pedal. I know he was probably gloved. We know he was covered in all black in terms of his face and all, but he would have been bloody. Do you necessarily agree with that, or is there any way he came out of there unscathed?
You know what? He even if he came out of there unscathed, he's going to have a lot of their blood on him. They wouldn't be looking for his blood in his car so much as their blood. So if he didn't disrobe and find some way of cleaning, there's an enormous amount of blood in that car. And some of that, like she says, you can't clean. On something like upholstery, particularly if it's black, if you don't have a particular kind of light, it's really hard to find. The other thing is, even if you find it, how are you going to clean it? You can't use bleach on your fabric. And so some of those rubber things like the pedals, I mean, there are just a lot of places, like she mentioned, the pedals and other things that people don't ordinarily clean. You wouldn't think to get in between the little nooks and the crannies, you'd clean it well so that you don't see it. But that's a lot different than cleaning it so that the forensic people don't see it, because it gets in the nooks and the crannies, the places you can't clean, places you can't clean with bleach. So there's definitely the opportunity there for there to be a large treasure trove of blood items in his house, any place that he walked. Even if he cleans that, unless he cleaned that all real well with bleach, they'll still be able to collect DNA from that. And so there's just almost no way he could have cleaned all those things up that well. If he got into that car bloody, he's in big trouble. They're going to find it.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
back to that point, Dr. Miller, they say he cleaned, and I quote, every inch of that car, but there's cleaning and then there's cleaning so people like you can't find evidence. How difficult is it to clean so the scientists and the people processing the crime scene would find nothing? Very difficult, as you just asserted, I imagine.
Yeah, if he got into that car bloody, he will not have cleaned it well enough. I would be shocked unless he actually went and steam cleaned the upholstery and the whole inside of the car. It's almost impossible to find all the little places where you can get blood, whether it's on the finger, on the steering wheel, or in the little nooks and crannies. It's really the nooks and crannies. It's easy to clean the steering wheel. It's easy to clean up these places, but to be able to find them, you can use certain kinds of lights and chemicals, and you can find where the blood is. And he can't do that. He doesn't have that and go, okay, where's the blood? Okay, I'll clean up that area. The other thing is you can't clean your upholstery and that stuff with bleach. Some of that soaks into the fabric, but then down into the rubber cushion. Mm-hmm. So if blood gets into that, you didn't clean that out, unless, of course, you steam cleaned the entire thing. So even meticulously doing it with a toothbrush isn't going to get inside the upholstery. It's not going to get inside anything that it can soak into, and you're not going to find it in all the places where you're possibly going to have touched.
And they obviously
Jennifer and I talked about that.
Yeah, go ahead, Sonny.
I'm sorry. Jennifer and I were on law and crime together, and we were also talking about the crime scene, the bloody, which is why we think that the FBI Philadelphia still has the car. They have the capabilities of doing all of that. And see, they're going to take out the seat. They're going to take out the floors. They're actually going to pull everything off. And one of the things that I looked at in the body cam footage of him driving the car in one of the stops, in which people thought, the police may have had something to do with that. That's called a whisper stop. That a term that most people don't know, a whisper stop. But we were thinking that, the gear shift is on here. So while most people are wiping this way, blood it travels and goes down. You figure the coagulation, right, Dr. Miller, and all of the ways in which you get in those things. You can clean on the surface of something, but what the FBI does in their forensic team is to take everything apart, every piece of it. So they're going to look in door jambs. They're going to look for every single thing and literally take the car apart in ways that an ordinary citizen cannot take a car apart, to examine it with the special lights, with the special chemicals that Dr. Miller knows so much about. And you just cannot get there. You can't you're going to miss something.
And a lot of it is, like she said, is the taking it apart. If it gets in that gear shift, if it gets into those little areas, you can't see it. And even if you can't clean it. Once you take all those little, they'll take the seats out, they'll take the gear shift out, they'll take all that apart. And it's almost impossible to clean that well. I mean, but again, he could have been covered well. He could have planned. I mean, it does seem that he did some planning.
Yes.
And so he obviously had a face mask and some of those other things. And so, I mean, it's very possible that, he could have been covered. I mean, we don't know. We don't know. But if he didn't, then they're going to find blood in that car and possibly in his house as well.
And Sonny answered that was my question, if they're going to rip this car apart, and clearly they are. We're going to bounce back to DNA in just a moment, but Sonny, to you, again, your friend Jennifer Koffendorfer and Jonathan Gillum, who's on our show, they both spoke out today or yesterday about their issue with internet sleuths, and I'm curious to get your take on this. Actually, both of your takes on this. With Gillum saying, I didn't have a problem with them at first, but now they're inciting things. He's pointing to Dylan Mortensen, the roommate, who's taking a lot of heat because she ran back into the room and locked herself in there. Jonathan said they're making mountains out of molehills, and they're actually, in the case of this girl, causing the public to turn on certain people. So online sleuths are becoming a problem. Keep in mind, STS Nation, our audience is the smartest, the best in true crime. So I don't want to upset them, but Sunny, what do you think of online sleuthing? Do they help or hurt?
I think it depends on what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what they're saying. I am deeply concerned, and I'm also a victims advocate, deeply concerned about DM and the level of fierceness coming, with the questions. Often people always think they will know what they will do. And that becomes problematic because we, the public, law enforcement, and the family needs DM to cooperate, to provide the information in the manner in which she saw it. And when people become so traumatized, they want to pull back. To find out that you were in a home where a horrific murder took place, it is just too much. And while people think in some cases they're being helpful, a lot of times they're also being harmful. And that's not good for the case. It's not good for the public information. And it's really not good for the family that are seeking answers. In some cases, sleuths can find, they can help locate what their work and what they're doing. But you have to have integrity about what you're doing and what you're saying. You're making yourself a part of a case that really involves people's lives.
Good point. Excellent point. This isn't just us, guessing on football games, right? This does involve victims and people's real lives. But Dr. Miller, you wanted to make a point?
I did. I handle a lot of sexual assaults and murders, and I end up, a lot of this paperwork ends up on my desk, and we don't know what people that are there, that are victims, that are eyewitnesses in close. We don't know what they're going to do. People that are raped, they have all kinds of different responses. And so for us to think, even for one victim to think that they know what another victim should have done or what I would have done in that situation, you can't know. You cannot know. We all have a different reaction. And it's not for us to look at what she did and go, well, that's not right. She must have been guilty of something. No, we can't do that. We have to allow them, like Sunny said, to be able to tell their story and not be judged for it, so that they can tell their story openly and honestly, without any repercussions for just telling the truth. And okay, I don't know why I did that, and that's fine, and that's normal. That was really the point I wanted to make is it's normal, and we shouldn't judge them for whatever actions that they took.
And I was married to a predator. Let me say that. I'm getting ready to put that out there for your audience so they will understand. I have my TED Talk is about being married to a man that I thought was so wonderful, who molested my daughter. I slept in the same bed. My reaction is someone who I can, even though I'm very short, can be very powerful and violent. I had to quickly think about what was best. Of course, police were called immediately, because it was a whole school thing. But how you think you will respond and what you do. People saying, oh, well, if that was me, I would have done this. I've gotten that a lot from people. Well, why didn't you kill him? I was a mother of 4 very young children. What do you think? So I think, as Dr. Miller has said, because we have both looked at a lot of sexual assault cases, don't judge. Don't think that you will know that you know what you will do, because when you are in the moment, you are responding in the moment. And it is really dangerous to do anything other than give people grace when you don't know everything.
And I'm really sorry that you experienced that. And that is an excellent point on your part to highlight. You just don't know. I do not know what I would do in that situation. God forbid it happened. And I'm glad that you were able to resolve it. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Joseph Scott Morgan, he's a well-known forensic expert, not unlike Dr. Monty Miller. he came out, I think I saw this on Twitter. He hosts a podcast, by the way, called Body Bags, and said, I think that's where the attack initiated, and that's important. He's speaking about the knife sheath now, Dr. Miller. It goes to progression, and it goes to who the target was. That was perhaps the specific location he was bound for. I do believe, if I am correct, that that knife sheath was found next to Madison Mogen's body. Do you agree with this, that possibly she or Kaylee, because they were in the same room, were the target, and that the sheath might indicate that?
Well, I mean, if he stalked them long enough, he would know, what rooms they were in. So, I mean, that certainly is possible if he really stalked them and watched them closely. He might have had a target and he didn't know what room they were in, too. Figured he starts at the top or whatever. The sheath could be an indication of where he started, but there's going to be a lot more indications. I mean, the first murder, there's going to be no blood when he walks into the room. He's going to be bloody. There's going to be some blood dripping. There is a progression, and it's not just the knife, right? There's blood. There's drops of blood. Would be hard. He definitely didn't change and clean up between rooms, so there's likely to be blood. Maybe even some of his dripping as he goes from one room to the other. I'm not familiar with the layout of the house, but it's very likely that they have a very good idea of where he started and the progression and who he killed next. And maybe there's reason for that. If you look at the layout of the house, maybe it was random. Maybe he started with one person. Maybe he killed one person till he found who he wanted to kill, and then he left. And that's why he left, DM alone when he walked by. He was done. But the knife sheath is important. It's part of the story. It's part of what they will look at to determine where that started. But the entire crime scene will help tell them, much more than just the knife sheath alone. It's really the totality of the thing. And it's really just looking at all the details and trying to figure that out. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what order it went in, although it's curious and it's nice. 4 people lost their lives here, and if he killed them, in any order, they're just as dead, and it's just as sad, and it's more of a curiosity to want to know some of these things. Might be important in court, but back to the knife sheath, though, yes, it very well could be part of what they, it will be part of what they look at to decide, in what order and how this happened.
And Sonny, I want to get back to you in 1 second about what you just mentioned, but Joseph Scott Morgan was very illustrative in his quote. He says, it's a very dramatic thing when you think about it. He's near the bed, he grabs the handle of the blade and flips that button on the sheath, while his other hand drops the sheath in the bed after drawing the knife. You can kind of visualize that, and it's quite eerie. But Sonny, in light of, you discussing what happened being married, as you said, to a predator, there are a lot of people out there, more than we think, living in compromised situations with people that they might be scared of, they might not condone the behavior. To what extreme, we don't know. But I'm curious, what advice would you give to a victim right now who finds himself in a similar situation?
So my husband at the time was like, everybody adored him. He was the man's man, very involved in the community. Those are the type of predators that you have to be very careful of, because we didn't have arguments. We lived well. He was well liked and well known in the community. But on the opposite side, if you are with someone who has predatory behavior that you notice and that you feel threatened by, that others feel threatened by, those are the individuals that you need to try to get away from. And working with domestic and sexual violence victims, I never tell a person that you must leave right now, even though their lives may be in extreme danger, because people only leave when they are prepared to leave, when they are ready to leave, and if they want to leave those situations. I always tell people, get a plan together. Think about what your life looks like outside of that individual. Be careful with contacting the police. Although we think people should contact the police, we don't want people to contact the police. Nothing happens, and then they wind up in situations like murder or death. I think you have to take every situation step by step. What happened with the person that I was married to? We were married for years. We had multiple children. So he is the father of my children, my last two children, biological father. He's the legal father. He was the legal father. He's deceased now, of all of my children. And no, I did not kill him. He spent a lot of time in prison too, more than almost 17 years, because this happened in 2003. But I made a very conscious decision that when the school called me to say that something happened, I actually did something about it. I did not think about how my children were going to be. I told them from the school, because I was actually on the school board at the time. And I told the teachers, follow the process. There's a process in place, and sometimes people don't know what those processes are, but law enforcement is available. There are shelters and services, and I would suggest that they seek those out and try to make a plan that allows them to feel safe and be safe in conditions that allow them not to just survive the moment, but to thrive ultimately sometime later.
It's a comparison probably not to be made, but when you talked about it, remind me of like an alcoholic in AA. You've got to want to quit. You've got to want it. They always say that when people are trying to quit a bad habit. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're being victimized, take Sonny's advice. I can tell you, before I began reporting at Fox News Channel, I was hired by the flagship station as an investigative reporter at Fox 5 in New York. And my first or second day on the job, someone came up and said, "You know whose seat that is?" And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." Turns out there was a rising star. He was going to be moved over to Fox News Channel. I'm not going to mention his name. You can go Google it and find out. But he was accused and then convicted of molesting his own 2-year-old daughter, was sentenced to many years in prison. And again, he was, according to reports, a very affable guy. People liked him in the newsroom. So you just can never really judge a book by its cover. And it was disheartening, to say the least, that I was sitting in that same chair, not an auspicious start, but things
it probably made you feel a little queasy and uneasy, right? 100%. Because you don't know what you don't know, and people can be predators. People who prey, and I say this all the time, are very good at what they do, which is why they often get away with it for a very long time. Now, my oldest daughter was his last victim. But years later, family members, nobody showed up for court. They didn't want to say anything. But you can't worry about what other people won't do. I did what I needed to do. The prosecutor and I, who is still at the prosecution office, we're very good friends. We talk regularly. There are things that some people are determined to do, and some things that others are not. I don't try to judge people for what they don't do. Some people don't say anything. Dr. Miller, I'm sure you know that. Some victims are very silent in their grief and pain. But
yeah, I mean, a lot of the victims don't speak up, and a lot of it, comes up to, that's not to blame the victims. It's not their fault in any way. A lot of them are young children, and young adults, and even the older adults. They have reasons why they don't want it. They're embarrassed. They don't want to go through it. And then they don't want to have to go through it again. They feel like they're raped again by having to go through it up there on the stand and in front of everybody and talk about it 100 times. And, some people are just more private and they don't want to do that. And these predators are very good at picking out their prey. They're very good at blending in. It's what they do. Everybody, nobody can really tell a good liar. That's what makes them good liars, right? And that's all that it is. And they're hidden out there. And they're hidden right in plain sight.
Well, social media has amplified the court of public opinion, but I don't think it's for us to judge anyone else's actions. But that is just my 2 cents. Dr. Miller, back to this knife sheath. This is kind of the focal point. When do you think they would have zeroed in on it, and what did it mean to law enforcement upon finding this knife sheath?
Well, I think right away they knew that it was odd to the crime scene, it sitting on the bed of potentially what may have looked to them from looking at the crime scene was the first victim. And if that's the case, looking at it that way, they think that's a prime piece of evidence. And again, you assume that it came from the killer, and then you don't find a knife. The stab wounds are consistent with that. You think the killer, may have left this either on accident or on purpose. But you think you have a good piece of evidence. Going through the rest of the house, even if he has, cut his hand on something and he's bleeding in that house, you won't know it's his blood till you test, hundreds of spots. You're going to get one victim and then another victim and another victim. I'm sure their blood is plentiful. It would be hard to find his DNA, his blood in that mess. That knife was a way for them to, right at the very beginning, get some DNA that then they could connect to somebody. I mean, even if he had borrowed the knife or stolen the knife, they still might be able to track the person who had that knife and go, well, okay, that was stolen by, your buddy, or, it was borrowed by your buddy. And so either way, that knife to them is an excellent opportunity to get some DNA right at the beginning and to start tracking their killer.
And we discussed some talking points prior to the show, Dr. Miller, and you wrote to me, it could also be planted or stolen or borrowed knife. So you say the DNA may not be from the perpetrator, but police would still need to do even more work if they have the DNA. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, these people a lot of times will go go to Kmart or whatever and buy the killing supplies that they need. They'll also go to a knife store and buy the knife that they're going to need. But you might just, get one at the swap meet. It might be somebody else's that they had for a long time that they used, at work or whatever, and, might have their DNA on it for just because they used it for a long time. You pick it up, you use it one time, you get somebody else's DNA. And so it's not always connected to the crime. We know that the knife blade probably didn't belong there. We know that it was left by the person, likely was to be left by the perpetrator, but we don't necessarily know that that's his DNA on the knife sheath. And that's why, you have to do all the other investigative work. You need to look at that car, you find their DNA in that car, then you start being able to connect the dots. But you need some other dots to connect because we don't know for sure if the DNA on that knife came from the perpetrator.
Interesting point, because you assume that it does. Sonny, to you, and we're going to get back to the doctor on this as well, but we had a guest on our program named Barbara Ray Venter, who's a real pioneer in IgG, which is investigative genetic genealogy. She actually cracked the Golden State Killer case using that. Databases like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, in general, how is technology and the advancement of science changing the playing field in terms of catching these perpetrators?
For law enforcement, when you think about how they collect DNA, they do it with a search warrant, like I believe they did with they asked for a search warrant to collect this DNA to confirm what Dr. Miller was talking about. And if your DNA is not in a database, in a database that like CODIS that law enforcement would use, and if you don't do something, a lot of times they can pick up DNA if somebody, if they're following them, if there's an investigation, people tend to just throw things away. That's another way. But with these genealogy apps and opportunities, people are sending in their DNA to get connected to other family members and find folks. And there's some agreement with some of the institutions, because there was an article a long time ago that I read about how people are feeling compromised. But when you have that relationship with these ancestry.coms and other things, that means the DNA is existing in a different database that you can then go to and make comparisons for when you have people that might be suspects. So it can trace. It's been used in several cases. I can't think of them exactly off the top of my head, but I know in some cases in recent years that DNA going through those systems have been used to connect, like your previous guest said. People are, they want to find out. In fact, my son and I and my kids, we were talking about, going through the ancestry.com, you had to find out. And then my mind kicked in, and my kids, they come from a law enforcement family. They're like, are we sure we want to do this? So, it is really technology advancing relationships that are positive in one way, but then they are good for investigative tools in another way, because the law enforcement can seek to get a warrant that may or may not be granted, and trying to get, samples from folks. And then it gives you a thread of individuals, because, and I'm not sure, well, I am kind of sure with the suspect, apparently, because they didn't have his DNA, there was things that he threw away in the neighbor's garbage that had his father's DNA on it, I believe, which is what they have been talking about initially, because they didn't get a DNA sample from him until the arrest, because it, I believe, was a part of the arrest warrant.
Dr.
To
Miller,
get his specific.
Yeah, if I'm correct about this, they traced his touch DNA on the sheath back to the father's DNA from the garbage. Is that how you understand it, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, I mean, they did watch him for several days. He did throw some trash away in the neighbor's trash cans. I don't know if where they got the trash that they ran for DNA. I think they got that just out of his trash can, out of his father's, his
What's
family.
odd is I believe, and I might be wrong about this, they got it out of the neighbor's trash can, which his father, I guess, threw the garbage in there for whatever reason.
Whatever it was, I mean, they got some DNA and whatever. The thing is, the genealogy databases are, I mean, the police are doing the same thing that the public's trying to do. Do we have a relative of this guy, if he's not a criminal and he's not in the, CODIS database, the DNA fingerprint database, then they don't have any place else to turn. The public database, I mean, there's, millions of people in those, and they're spread out across all the states. And the police are trying to do the same thing. Can we connect a relative to this DNA? And the thing is, you might be able to not commit a crime to get your DNA put into CODIS, but you can't prevent all your relatives from putting their DNA in, and then all it takes is for them to go, to find your DNA and put it in there and go, okay, well, we have someone who looks like he's a cousin, and go to that person and go, do you know a cousin who lives anywhere close to where these murders happened? And she goes, well, yeah, cousin Bryan lives, 3 miles away. So with a lot of people in the database, you cover a lot of ground. You don't have just the criminals. There's also missing persons in that database and some other people, the family members looking for missing persons. But if they're not in there, you have nothing else to compare it to. And these databases are widespread. There's millions of people in them, and you can't hide all your relatives. How likely is it? I mean, I know I have relatives in there, and I haven't put mine in there. And I mean, I don't feel like there's any problem with it, but I know who my relatives are, and I'm not looking to find anybody or anything like that. But, you can make yours public or private. People can make it so that people can't search, so that people can't search.
Well, if it's private, law enforcement can still get at it, or no?
I'm not sure how that works. So you can put your profile in there and say, listen, I want to search and see if I can find any relatives, but I don't want anybody to find me. How that relates to the police, I think they do a public search. I think they can do, under certain circumstances, with a search warrant, I think they can do an exhaustive search of even the people who have theirs private. But I don't know how that works. I'm not really sure. But from what I've seen, from what I've heard, that's kind of the way that works. But you can't keep some of it private.
And we're going to get to STS Nation's questions and comments in just a moment. But as you astutely pointed out, and Barbara Ray Venter told us on our program, unlike the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, where they used this public DNA as a last resort to finally get him before the lead detective retired, as Barbara Ray Venter told us the story. They wanted to catch him before the lead investigator's retirement. Here, it was a primary action. It was, she said, one of the few times that she knows of that it was used during an active case. So do you think, Dr. Miller, we're going to start to see this Ancestry.com, the IgG, the 23andMe's used during active cases more often moving forward?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think that's one of the first things they're going to do now. I think they're going to all see the value in this. Just like when the Golden State Killer thing happened, we've seen several crimes solved that way because, that's what we do. Science moves forward and someone goes, oh, hey, here's a really good way to use it. And someone else goes, oh, that's great. I got the same problem. And now we're seeing how valuable this could be. I mean, of course, it's like, and more people are adding to it all the time. Yeah, and I hope the police do. It gives us an excellent way to track some of these unknown people, even if we don't have their DNA. You can't hide all your relatives. So, yeah, I think we're going to see it a lot more. I think we're going to see it regularly from now on.
And we'll move on to some questions and comments. The first one comes from the real Patrician, and she writes, and I agree already, even though it's only been about an hour. She writes, Sonny is a great panel guest. And I'll add, so is Dr. Monty Miller. And that's why we have the best guests in the business. She writes, regarding the DNA, I would like to know in general whether it can be transferred from somewhere else, and specifically if and how Kohberger's DNA could have gotten on the sheath, even through leather gloves, for example. Is that possible, Dr. Miller?
Well, it didn't come from through the leather gloves, but he, was probably carrying it around and using it at other times. His DNA got on it from handling it, when he bought it and pulls the knife in and out. He's probably the only one, or likely one of the only people who's handled the knife. So I don't know how long he's had it, but his DNA would just build up over time and kind of soak into the leather, particularly if there are times when he's sweaty and things like that. So that stuff soaks in, and the DNA is going to last until it's going to be degraded by moisture, chemicals, sunlight, heat. But if it's in an air-conditioned room, the DNA is not going to go away. So his DNA was likely to be on that before he went in, to kill. And then his DNA didn't come likely from, it definitely didn't get transferred through the leather gloves. But you can also stick it, between your pants and your body where you might hold it. That, anytime it touches the skin or anything like that, there's going to be DNA transfer, and certainly it's going to build up over time and cling and soak into leather.
And Dr. Miller, it is very hard to pull off a perfect crime with science these days, is it not?
It is, and it's just they panic, and the senses are heightened. They're excited. It's euphoria to them to kill somebody, and it's hard to be focused when you're doing that. And so they're kind of contrary mechanisms at work here, where they're trying to be meticulous and try to do something, and yet they're trying to live in this euphoric moment, and it's just hard, really, to just do everything perfectly.
Sonny, this one comes from Angela Bangela. I love that name. Is it possible that they have more DNA than what was on the sheath, and they're simply not going to show their complete hand? We know this was the probable cause affidavit, but we don't know everything yet, right, Sonny?
Right. Yeah. We don't know everything. We won't know everything. And it's actually a good thing that we don't know everything, because now they're going to have to reveal everything that they know to the defense team. But the 911 call, that was something that I talked about on another show. The 911 call has not been released. And because there's now a gag order in place, we're going to know less real information. And yeah, we there could be more things, but I think that law enforcement has done a very good job. And I can be very critical of law enforcement processes and practices, but I think in a lot of ways they did what was necessary.
Well, a lot more information will come out, as they do all the science and as they do all those things. And, for the same reason they didn't tell us anything about the knife, they're not telling us about a lot of things because they have to investigate these things. And so, they did good police work. I mean, they were complaining at the time that, hey, you're not releasing enough information. The families were unhappy. They weren't getting enough information. They cannot feed all of the information that they have because it affects the investigation. So it's ongoing. They don't have all the answers yet, and they certainly don't want to imply things that they can't prove.
And
that's what Dr. Miller said. Yeah, they don't have. This isn't an active investigation.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I can remember a time not long ago where people were saying the Moscow Police Department didn't know what they were doing. It appears that they knew what they were doing very well. This next comment comes from user with a ton of letters after their name. And they say, I saw a picture today of Kohberger's dad using wet, dry vac to clean up the busted glass from the raid. Wouldn't all vacuums, wet vacs, rags, etc., be confiscated for forensic analysis after he cleaned the car post-raid? Sonny, would they collect all this?
Yeah, but we don't know if the father went out and bought another one. So what in the search warrant, and I believe I answered this for one of the other individuals. In the search warrant, because they were watching in Kohberger for a while, they would be making sure that they're asking in that search warrant for things that they might find necessary, and that could have been, that the father just brought another one. They might have thought it was useful and may not, but I just think they are. Now that is a different search team. So mind you, we're talking about two different states, and that's something that I think sometimes people get confused in. One is in Idaho, but this, where the father lives, is in Pennsylvania. So that is, and it's also a different type of law enforcement team. So the execution of a search warrant happens differently, and with a team that is specializes in that would do when you go in at a certain time of night. That's a no-knock warrant often, and that's carried out in on the warrant is very specific that you can only do this for a certain amount of time based on, what you're looking for, the judges. And it is very clear though how you do it, who you do it with. And those are a lot of different partners. So you have a lead agency, then you always have somebody from the state police, because a lot of times people think that this is like one team. No-knock search warrants and things like that happen with multiple teams, and they would have addressed what do we need to get, because that would be part of the search warrant. It might not say get the hand vac or something like that, but the police officers and the team would know what they thought that they need to execute the warrant and to get the information for the ongoing investigation, if that makes sense.
They also probably wouldn't have needed to worry about the shop vac at the house in Pennsylvania. That's where they did the search warrant. They're probably not concerned about him cleaning up the car there. That was something that he did, or unless he did it there. And even if he did it there, they also contest that. They don't collect everything at a crime scene. They get one crack at it. So there are things like that vacuum where they test with chemicals, and if they don't find any blood, which is what they're looking for, then they just move on. Okay, we're done with the shop vac. They don't take all of the rags that are in the entire house. They look at them, they find some dirty ones or some wet ones or some ones that they think are probative, and they'll collect those. But, they don't just collect everything. But anything that they would have released that they would have thought important, that they would have seen, they would have tested. Certainly, if he had used that shop vac, they would have collected that and taken it to the lab. So maybe he has two, maybe he bought another one. But yeah, I mean, it just depends on the situation.
And again, we're really just seeing pieces of the puzzle, not the entire puzzle. This was a two-part question, Dr. Miller. They're also asking, would they have taken the parents' cell phones and technology to do forensic analysis on that?
It just depends on the situation. I mean, if the parents were in Pennsylvania when this happened, and I understand his dad came out, it was what he did every year to drive out and drive there. I mean, if his parents were in Pennsylvania, then, you know, unless there is some reason to think that there's information on their phones, you know, text messages and those things, I wouldn't think that they would necessarily do that. But they might go through and ask for those things. That might be one of those things that they've done and we don't even know about.
Yeah. And they actually don't need to have the physical phone for them to look at some of the investigative data, like the footprint that Dr. Miller talked about earlier, that they have for Kohberger. They can look at the footprint. They can get records without actually having to seize the physical phone to make a determination whether that's relevant for their investigation.
Interesting. This comment comes from Lisa Fort, 1575. Will you all go over, and Sonny, I'll throw this to you, and don't mean to put you on the spot here, but this came up, I saw from a few different commenters. Could you go over the timeline according to the probable cause affidavit and explain how a DoorDash delivery person could arrive at 4 a.m. and the killer could be pulling away from the scene at 4:20 a.m.? It's a very tight timeline. Any thoughts on that?
So here's the affidavit, and I saw that as one of the questions in there with the timeline of, and people have been talking about that. DoorDash, if you order DoorDash, it's a come and go. We don't know, based on the probable cause and the affidavit, whether Kohberger was in the house at the time that the DoorDash individual came. Okay, but when you think about timelines and what it looks like, it seems more likely that he may have been in the house. He could have been, I should say, because I don't like the hype thing. So he could have been in the home. He could have been in the mix of, you know, committing the crime. It would still also probably leave him time to meet face to face with DM and leave. We don't know how long these murders took, but it would seem like 4 people, gruesome crime, having to move about in the darkness of the night, and someone leaving. If you think about how long 20 minutes is, and Dr. Miller, I'm sure, you know, you've had to do this before. Take 20 minutes and see how long that is. Run it on the clock and watch the time tick away. 20 minutes is actually a really long time.
20 minutes is a long time.
Doesn't feel like it when you're with my 8, 6, and 3-year-old. Then it feels a lot longer, but I do understand what you're saying. By TV news standards, 20 minutes is basically a full-length documentary. Just to put some perspective there, an average news story you see on television is somewhere between a minute and 15 seconds and a minute and 30 seconds. So 20 minutes, you can do a lot. And that was my next question to you, Dr. Miller. I assume you've seen maybe not crimes as savage as this one, but people are asking, how could he have murdered 4 people in basically a 15-minute window, maybe a 17-minute window? It is possible, right?
I mean, you just think of, you know, sneak into someone's room and start stabbing them, you know, and that's going to end pretty quickly. You know, and then you move to the next room. I mean, I can't imagine the struggle 5 minutes and the rest of the house not hearing it. You know, you might stab somebody and wait for a minute and enjoy killing them or something, but 20 minutes is a long time. I mean, it's probably only take, you know, a couple minutes, 3 minutes to stab each person a few times, and then move to the next room. 20 minutes is a lot of time. 20 minutes is a lot of time.
And adrenaline, right, Dr. Miller? The adrenaline that would have to be pumping in order for you to do what you do. It's like a mom picking up a car off of her child or something. You get a lot of things going, and you're moving quickly. And in a crisis, people have to think about the things, if they've ever been in a crisis, how fast things happen in a short period of time. When there's a fire, people moving. You understand what I'm saying, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, I mean, if any one of us just walk into a room and stay there for 5 minutes, just quiet, silent, just watching your phone. Walk to another room, wait 5 minutes. It's a long time. It's ample time. I mean, 4 people, 20 minutes is ample time to do all that and leave.
Sonny, this next question is basically purely speculative, but I'm going to toss it to you anyway. It comes from Cher, not the famous singer, or maybe it is. Do you think Bryan Kohberger's father was aware of the incident? I mean, we know now that they drove back from Washington State. They were in a car for a couple of days, more than that, and it was all over the national news that they were looking for this car. So what's your gut telling you, that he knew something or didn't know anything?
No, I don't think I kind of saw that question. I do not believe that the father knew what was going on. I do not believe that his parents are involved. That is pure speculation. It is, when I looked at the body cam, the only time that I've been able to see the father, Kohberger's father, was in the body cam at the initial police stop. And, I'm looking at body language. I'm looking at father's behavior. This was a trip that was already planned, something that they had done previously. So it wasn't anything that was out of the ordinary for the family. And, his father seemed very proud of him when he talked about, in the car. He said, yeah, we're just driving and I just don't think that the father knew. And we always think that we know what our kids are doing, what they will do and what they won't do. And we don't. That's just the bottom line. You just don't.
Well said. This next one comes from an attorney named Shannon Ellison. And this one's for you, Dr. Miller. Goes to show you why we have the smartest audience. She writes, I was surprised the DNA, assuming it's touch DNA, was found on only the snap and not the leather portion of the sheath. I was taught as a rule of thumb that touch DNA is usually found on rough surfaces, while fingerprints are more likely found on smooth surfaces like metal, glass, etc. For example, the smooth surface of a firearm would usually yield the fingerprints, and the CST would focus on swabbing the grip for touch DNA. I know it is possible for the reverse situation to happen, but I was somewhat surprised there wasn't any DNA on the leather portion, aka the rough part of the sheath as well. Your thoughts on this?
I don't think we know where the DNA. We do know that there was some on the snap, which they go after because had he borrowed the knife, whoever opened that knife last, that might be where you would find, someone's DNA. So they're going to swab that area. Yes, the smooth areas don't hold DNA as well. And the reason is because it can be wiped off more easily. It also, a rough surface will have a tendency, kind of like sandpaper, to kind of grind your skin a little, even microscopically, and so it's going to end up with more DNA. But that's not to say the smooth surfaces don't have DNA. And maybe the other part of the leather knife had a mixture. Maybe it had some of his dad's DNA or somebody else's DNA on the knife. And I don't think we know that there isn't any DNA on the rest of the knife. But they might have gotten some DNA off that snap, and they said, this is the DNA we're going to go with because we got a good DNA sample off of the snap, which is probably the best sample we can get from this knife.
And final question, and then some final thoughts. This one comes from MTD 7196. Sonny, I'll throw this one to you, and then we can get the doctor's take. Will finding any of the Idaho 4's DNA inside Kohberger's car or his blood spatter on the dog or anywhere in that house be the smoking gun that Kohberger's defense team will not be able to argue around?
What I think, fine, yes. I'm going to say it. It will be very important. In addition to the digital footprint, you know, the DNA and the digital footprint coming together will all matter. So I think there's a lot of ways that a defense team will try to argue presence, potential for contamination, cross contamination. All of those things will be relevant for a DNA team, for a defense team. I just want people to understand this. We're so early in all of this. There's a lot of speculation that we're doing. We don't know what we don't know. And the defense team doesn't know what they don't know because it's going to take them a long time to catch up because this is still an active investigation. I think we all just have to sit back, be patient, continue to unfold like on your amazing show, the questions that people may have, but really inform them with answers that are not hyperbolic, but realistic so people can understand processes. And we're just not there yet.
Very well put. To you, Dr. Miller, and then we'll get to closing comments. What would be the irrefutable evidence that the prosecutor needs? Is there such a thing?
Well, I mean, I think checkmate would be finding some of their DNA in his car, finding some of that blood, or finding his DNA like in blood somewhere at the crime scene, like perhaps maybe he cut his hand or somehow he got injured during this attack in some way. I think both of those things are checkmate. He may already be in that situation, but those things will make it so that it's almost unarguable that he was there during those murders if his blood is in that house or if their blood is in that car or in his house anywhere.
She is Sunny Slaughter, founding and managing principal of Sunny Slaughter Consulting. She's been called the master connector and the Olivia Pope of crime, and we know why now after this appearance. Sunny, Kohberger is due back in court on Thursday. What do you think we can expect to see then, and what are you looking for in the coming days?
I expect that we will hear the no bond, of course, that we will find out more. We will learn if he is actually getting a different attorney other than the one that he has right now. And we'll hear whether he's going to say that he's not guilty.
Dr. Monty Miller has the education, training, and experience to provide expert services related to DNA, crime lab, crime scene investigation, and paternity. He previously worked for the Texas Department of Public Safety State Crime Lab as a forensic scientist. He is the man who helps solve cases. Dr. Miller, will this be ultimately litigated in court based on all the forensic evidence?
Unless he pleads guilty. I mean, you can plead guilty and say, yeah, I did it, but most of the time, they don't have a lot to gain in a case like this because, they're going to go after the death penalty. And so I'd say we're headed for trial. When it gets to that point and a lot of this science is done and they're able to tell us that the investigation is done and it all comes out, I'm sure there's just going to be a wealth of more information that they're going to collect.
And a quick programming note, the team behind the scenes, the great producer, Steve Cohen, and Ileana Diaz, one of the producers, they have me working double time today. We're going to do another show on the missing woman in Cohasset, Massachusetts. Anna Walsh, her husband, arrested and had a court appearance. So that episode will be out as well. Great thanks to Sunny Slaughter and to Dr. Monty Miller. Don't you worry. We'll be back with another episode of Surviving the Survivor of America.